Today's Dhamma talk will be on the mindful contemplation of the aggregate of consciousness, Vijnana Kanda, in the Pali scriptural language. Now, for the last couple of Dhamma talks, we've been dealing with the contemplation of Dhammas, the fourth establishment of mindfulness, and part of this fourth establishment of mindfulness is the contemplation of the hindrances, then followed by the contemplation of the aggregates, and then to be followed by the contemplation of the sense spheres, then the contemplation of the seven awakening factors, and finally the contemplation of the Four Noble Truths. Now, out of the five aggregates, we have briefly dealt with the aggregate of materiality, Rupa Kanda. We have also briefly touched upon the mindful contemplation of the aggregate of feelings, Vedana Kanda, and then we discussed somewhat in detail aspects connected to the mindful contemplation of the aggregate of cognition or perception, namely Sanya Kanda, and then during our previous Dhamma talk, we dealt with mental formations, namely Sankhara Kanda in the Pali scriptural language. Now, today we'll focus on the aggregate of consciousness. Now, the instruction that the Buddha has given in the Satipatthana Sutta regarding this aggregate of consciousness is as follows, namely very short and simple. He or she knows such is consciousness, such its arising, and such its passing away. Now, in terms of etymology, Vijnana Kanda is the Pali technical term for this aggregate of consciousness, and the Pali expression Kanda means a group, a mass, or an aggregate, and then Vijnana here in this context of the five aggregates is to be understood as being conscious of something, being conscious of some object. And the Samyutta Nikaya, in its 22nd collection, namely on the aggregates, has the definition of what this aggregate of consciousness is about, and it says, and I'm quoting from Samyutta Nikaya 22, paragraph Sutta 48, whatever kind of consciousness there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, this is called the consciousness aggregate. When it comes to the contemplation of the aggregate, then what is under normal circumstances referred to as a being is analyzed into its certain constituent parts, such as the aggregate of materiality, of feelings, perceptions, and mental formations, and consciousness. And so what is considered as, or what is taken to be one solid being turns out to consist of different parts, and consciousness is one of them. And when it comes to these five aggregates, then we have to make a big, or we have to see these 5 aggregates in contradistinction to something else, namely Nibbana. And so what we have is, on the one hand side, the arising of this or that aggregates of formations, and then with Nibbana we have the non-arising of the aggregates. So the aggregates occur with regard to still to conditioned formations, and it follows that in Nibbana, do the 5 aggregates exist or not? The 5 aggregates of clinging, they don't exist, because the experience of Nibbana is the very opposite. It's the experience of total letting go. Letting go of the aggregate of the material formations, the aggregate of feelings, of perceptions, of mental formations, and even of consciousness. So it's a totally different experience. Similar to what we did during the previous Dhamma talk, let us, first of all, before we go into the theory connected with Vijnana or consciousness, let us look at some practical aspects that are accessible to a meditator. Now, with regard to consciousness itself, if we can say that it is impermanent, it is unsatisfactory, and it is lacking the self. Now, very careful contemplation of the predominant formations, and in particular consciousness, will sooner or later lead a meditator to understand that consciousness is different from what it appears to be at first sight, namely to be permanent. And so it is not permanent, but rather impermanent. More on this in a few moments. Now, the consciousness itself, even though it is extremely refined, is still unsatisfactory, especially when we compare it to the experience of the non-arising of formations. So the experience of Nibbana. As non-meditators, we tend to be under the impression that consciousness is something permanent, and that it is at least the consciousness part that is identical with the self. Now, careful contemplation of what really exists, and in particular of consciousness, sooner or later will lead us to the conclusion that even consciousness is not the self. It should not be identified with the self. Now, up to the 5th insight knowledge, namely the knowledge of dissolution, a meditator usually will be under the impression that consciousness is permanent, and certainly that it is somewhat permanent, cohesive, something compact. And this changes when a meditator keeps carefully observing the dissolution of formations. And so, when he or she sees how predominant material formations keep dissolving, and then how feelings keep dissolving, how the perceptions are also subject to dissolution, and how mental formations are dissolving, then eventually a meditator may also see how consciousness itself is dissolving. And so at this point in the practice, something special happens, namely, the mind assumes this certain quality, or this, it's not quality, but an ability to advert in a very quick succession, first to the dissolution of some material object, and then right the next in the next moment, it will then advert to the dissolution of consciousness itself. Now, when this happens, and so full awareness is there, then this may lead to an experience of fear. But this is not an ordinary type of fear, but rather Dhamma fear, and it has to happen like this. It is part and parcel of the meditation practice. Now, when one has this profound, or when one experiences this profoundly, then one will come to the conclusion that indeed consciousness is not permanent, but rather impermanent. Now, with careful observation, one thus comes to the understanding that certain consciousness is not a permanent linear event, but rather consciousness is something that consists of one moment of consciousness arising and passing away, one after another. And that each moment of consciousness is conditioned by the preceding moment of consciousness. A further understanding of consciousness can be gained in a very direct manner by a meditator through the experience of fruition, through fruition practice, and having the mind having taken Nibbana as an object, sooner or later it will come out of this fruition consciousness, and when this happens, then it may come out, then it may happen that consciousness itself is the first object. And all of the other objects of the other aggregates are not predominant at that point as yet. And so then for just a brief moment or two, one gets an idea of an experiential idea of what this consciousness is all about. But this is still somewhat coarse. And with this experience, it comes also an understanding of the extremely refined nature of consciousness in comparison to the other aggregates. So in comparison to the aggregate of formations of perceptions of feelings in materiality. And it is through one's own meditation practice that one can then also sooner or later gain an understanding of the difference between the arising of the aggregates and the non-arising of the aggregates. In particular, the non-arising of the aggregates of consciousness. When it comes to consciousness, then we need to see it in a context, and the Abhidhamma speaks of the four ultimate realities, namely consciousness, then mental factors, and matter and Nibbana. The first three still belong to the world of conditioned phenomena, whereas Nibbana belongs to the world of the unconditioned, and or otherwise the ultimate reality. Just to give you some general understanding or some general overview over consciousness, and based on the Buddha's Abhidhamma, in order to gain a really clear understanding of all these different classes of consciousness, probably one has to be a Buddha. And it's an extremely intricate system of different kinds of consciousness. Now, the Abhidhamma distinguishes 89 kinds of or classes of consciousness, and these are then being subdivided into sense sphere material consciousness as one category, then fine material consciousness as a second category, then immaterial kinds of or types of consciousness as a third category, and finally supramundane consciousness. And so in terms of the numbers, we have a total of 80 mundane types of consciousness and 8 supramundane types of consciousness. So what do you think are the 8 supramundane kinds of consciousness? Path and fruition, yes, and connected only to the first path of stream entry? Yes, that's correct. So we have classes of consciousness that are connected with Magga Chaita, namely the path consciousness, and then classes of, and then we have a form of consciousness that is connected with the fruition of the stream entry, and then the same thing for the path and fruition of once return, of non-return, and then of the path of holiness. Now, 4 kinds of or 3 categories are mentioned under mundane consciousness, and those are the sense sphere consciousness, then the fine material, and the immaterial, as explained already. And the sense sphere consciousness is consists of 54 kinds, and the fine material sphere consciousness consists of 15 kinds, and that of immaterial sense sphere immaterial sphere consciousness consists of 12. Now, to explain a little bit about what is meant by sense sphere consciousness. Now, this covers very ordinary kinds of consciousness, such as consciousness linked to the seeing process, or eye consciousness, and then any kind of consciousness linked to the hearing process, so hearing or ear consciousness, and then any kind of consciousness linked to the smelling process, so nose consciousness, and then the tongue consciousness, and then the body consciousness, and then finally there is consciousness related to the mind. And so these are in no way special kinds of consciousnesses. Those are types of consciousness that we experience in our ordinary life over and over again. Now, different from them is a class of consciousness that has to do with the meditation practice. And in particular, the practice of the jhanas, and when one practices these jhanas, then at first the so-called 4 or 5, depending on how one counts, the fine material jhanas will arise. So the fine material jhanas consist of certain jhanic factors such as initial application of the mind and sustained application of the mind, joint rapture, happiness, sukha, and one-pointedness of mind. Now, the next class of consciousness covers even more refined states coming in the or arising in the form of immaterial sphere consciousness. And those are types of consciousness that arise when one goes beyond the fine material jhana and then experiences the immaterial jhanas or absorption in the form of the jhanas of boundless space, boundless consciousness, and then neither perception nor non-perception. And I'm missing one. Of nothingness, yes. Now, so these are the 3 major classes under the mundane consciousness. Now, to take it a little bit further, namely the first category or class, that of the sense sphere consciousness, then can be further divided into sense sphere consciousness that is of an unwholesome consciousness, then that of rootless consciousness, and then of sense sphere beautiful consciousness. And 12 such kinds of consciousness, unwholesome consciousness, is mentioned, and 8 of them are rooted in greed, 2 in hatred, and 2 in delusion. And once a certain consciousness has arisen, be it wholesome or unwholesome, there will be a certain result. And thus we have unwholesome resultant consciousness and then wholesome resultant consciousness, and rootless functional consciousness. When it comes to the same sphere, beautiful types of consciousness, then a total of 24 are being mentioned. Now, just to give you an idea what some of the unwholesome kinds of consciousness are, they're described as, number one, rooted in greed, lobha, mulani, chittani, namely somnasa sahagatam detikata sampayutam asankarikam ekam, which means in English, one kind of consciousness accompanied by joy and then associated with wrong view and unprompted. Then we have one consciousness accompanied by joy and again associated with wrong view, but this time prompted. And then one kind of consciousness accompanied by joy, dissociated from wrong view and unprompted. Then another one accompanied by joy, dissociated from wrong view and prompted. And then the following are all accompanied by equanimity. And so then associated with wrong view in 2 cases, and then in other 2 cases dissociated from wrong view, and then prompted and unprompted. So a total of 8. Now, what we have here is, in this classification of different kinds of consciousness, namely classification by 3 criteria. The first one, whether this certain consciousness is accompanied by joy or by equanimity. And then furthermore, whether it is accompanied by wrong view or no, and then finally prompted or not prompted. Now, to start with the last aspect, prompted and not prompted, means and unprompted is simply naturally a certain consciousness that arises without any impulse or impact from outside. So without any physical, verbal, or mental impact. Now, right view and wrong view, right view understanding the nature of things, and wrong view not understanding reality. And so this somnasa sahagatam, or otherwise upeka sahagatam, refers to not the mental factor of equanimity, or the mental factor of joy, piti, but rather to the feeling, namely a pleasant feeling or a neutral feeling. Okay, so these are the 8 kinds of unwholesome consciousness rooted in greed. Then in the case of those 2 rooted in hatred, there is simply one consciousness accompanied by displeasure associated with aversion unprompted. And the second case is one consciousness accompanied by displeasure associated with aversion and prompted. And then in the last case, consciousness rooted in delusion, one consciousness accompanied by equanimity associated with doubt, and the last one is one consciousness accompanied by equanimity associated with restlessness. Among the rootless consciousness, we have things like I consciousness And as you mentioned earlier on, ear consciousness, nose, tongue, and body, and tongue consciousness, then body consciousness, accompanied by pain, receiving consciousness accompanied by equanimity, investigating consciousness accompanied by equanimity, and those are the ones. Now it will go too far to give you all the details of these. By beautiful consciousness are men and those who are rooted in wholesome roots such as non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. And again, these are, we have 8 in a sense here, wholesome consciousness, and just to give you a few, one consciousness accompanied by joy, associated by knowledge and unprompted. And then another one similar but prompted. And then consciousness accompanied by joy, dissociated from knowledge and unprompted, another one prompted. And then the last 4 are accompanied by equanimity. So these are some of the different kinds of consciousness that might arise in one's meditation practice. Now, these various kinds of conscious or types of consciousness can be classified also by way of their function, and a total of 14 functions is being mentioned in the Abhidhamma. And some of these functions are, well, the rebirth linking consciousness, as well as the life continuum bhavanga, as well as the death consciousness, Chutti, Citta. Rebirth linking consciousness is a type of consciousness or a function of consciousness, to be more precise, that occurs at the very beginning of an existence. So it is the very first consciousness that arises, and it will be influenced by the preceding, by the death consciousness of the preceding existence. So all of the karmic information, or to be more precise, the resultant karmic information will be passed on from death consciousness to rebirth linking consciousness. And then we have this so-called bhavanga consciousness, the life continuum, and it is that function of consciousness that occurs during active, in between some active type of consciousness. And it is a passive type of consciousness that occurs during deep and dreamless sleep, but it also occurs during our day, during the waking hours, as said, in between some active consciousness. And so it's of a passive nature. And this bhavanga citta, among all kinds of consciousness, is said to occur a lot, or the most frequently. And it is kind of like the stop-gap kind of consciousness. So it fills the gaps between the active consciousness. In the Abhidhamma, a term that is somewhat synonymous but not quite the same to Vijnana, consciousness, is citta, namely mind or consciousness. So in the context of the five aggregates, we speak of Vijnana, consciousness, and otherwise the term, like when it comes to the classification system of the Abhidhamma, which describes the mind, then the term citta is certainly used. And this citta, or also translated as consciousness in English, is then defined by the commentaries in three different ways, namely as the agent, as the instrument, and as an activity. And so as an activity, it simply means this process of being conscious moment by moment. And so within this, there is no self involved. So I'm quoting from page 27 of the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma, compiled by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and Dr. Vivekananda and Sadhu Sayādaw. As an activity, citta or consciousness is in itself nothing other than the process of being conscious of the object. So, the process of being conscious of the object one moment after another. The Pali expression for this is given as chintana matam citta. Now, the consciousness may be defined in a different way, namely as the instrument, and in this case, citta is that by means of which the accompanying mental factors are conscious of the object. Etena chinteti citam in Pali. And then, as an agent, citta or consciousness is that which is conscious of an object. Aramanam chinteti citam in the Pali scriptural language. Third, the definition as an activity is regarded to be the most adequate, and so basically it's consciousness is defined as an activity or as the process of being conscious of the various objects. Now, the sole aim of this of classifying or speaking of the mind is to defute or to defeat the idea of the existence of a self. So the mind is being described in a purely functional way, and and with this, there is no space left for the notion of a self or soul or an individual. Now, maybe this much for now on this mindful contemplation of the aggregates of consciousness. And let me conclude by wishing, may all of you, in line with these instructions given in the Satipatthana Sutta, know the nature of consciousness itself, and may you also know its arising, may you know its passing away. And thus understanding that consciousness is not the seat of the self or the ego, and also clearly understanding that it is not permanent in any way, nothing solid, but rather impermanent. Hence, may you further understand its unsatisfactory nature, and thus be able to detach from consciousness and just see it as another event, mental event, and thus may this prepare the ground for the realization of the ultimate reality of Nibbana. And this is it for now.